record button on my end. In the room, Roy is also recording, so we are, I think, ready to roll. And if anyone has any problems during the program, I do have the chat up for folks that are online, but if I don't see it right away, forgive me, because I might get a bit chatty during the program, but do know I will check it intermittently. I guess, welcome everyone. I think I know most people here, so hopefully we can be pretty, feel free to jump in and ask questions. We can be a bit informal, I think. But what I was asked to talk about today is historic clothing. So we're going to go through a program that really focuses more on how you can go about the process of researching clothing, especially historic clothing that you want to use for reenactments or for events. And I've been kind of doing it for a while. Not that I really care how long I've been doing it, because I feel like there's always new things to learn, but I have kind of bopped around a little bit and seen some different things, so I will try really hard to answer questions if anyone does have questions. But I did also want to say thank you to the Heritage Village for letting me come to the board members. I appreciate it. I am very, I feel pretty honored to be a notable speaker for 2026, because there's only 12, there's less than 12 of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are 10 speakers this month, I think, or this year. So thank you to the board for letting me come in and chat. So we're going to go over kind of what historic clothing is, how we can use it, how it impacts the stories that we want to tell. So I am hoping that at the end folks do have questions, because we will have a little bit of time. But historic clothing, from my perspective, is really just clothes from another time period. And at this point, I think the 1980s counts. If anyone watched Stranger Things, there was a lot of 1980s callbacks in that, and that's historic clothing. Even going back 10 years, we all have pieces that are that old in our wardrobe, but if we really want to create the look, we can definitely do it if we focus in on a specific time. So historic clothing is just clothes from another time period. And the reason that a lot of reenactors
be wearing historic clothing.
We're definitely wearing historic clothing. The reason that a lot of reenactors and people at historic sites and hobbyists use historic clothing is to help tell a story. We want to understand a time period, whether it's the architecture, the food, the social events, all of that comes together with clothing to help tell that story. So we really want to use that clothing to tell that bigger story, and it can also really make learning about a time period so much more interesting. Clothes are hopefully something we all wear and use and are familiar with. Some people are very picky. I once dated a fellow who only wore his socks inside out, which drove me nuts. So clothing is a very, very personal thing. And being able to connect to people with that is a really valuable tool that we can use when we're talking about historic clothing. Sometimes we see the term fashionable dress as well. What's fashionable for the time period or fashionable for the place? To me, that just means what fits into the culture. So thinking about what's fashionable for, we're in Mackinaw City, as most everybody knows, what's fashionable for Mackinaw City in the winter is very different than what's going to be fashionable in Tampa in December, or it's not December, it's February. But what's fashionable just means what makes sense for the time, for the place, for the activities. So it's a big word, but it's the clothes that fits the time, the place, the person, the occupation. It encompasses all of those things. It's also an expression of the individual person. We, like the fellow that always wears socks inside out, every person has their own comfort level and their own way of wearing things. So we do see that in history, and I don't want to overlook that. So it's an expression of how we dress, but overall, it's just clothes. It's just clothes. Easy peasy, right? So when we're looking at building a historic clothing wardrobe, whether it's the 1980s or the 19-teens, like we do at Heritage Village quite often, or 19-aughts, we start with our basic research. So I kind of like to break it down into 4 different categories. We, in a lot of instances, do have archaeology options to look at. You know, someone maybe lost a ring when they were hanging out laundry 100 years ago. Like, if archaeologists find that, we know that that was worn by someone that was, you know, living in that location. Archaeology, we'll talk about it a little bit more, can be a really tangible way to look at historic clothing. We also, of course, look at written sources. Those include quite a wide range of things. So we'll talk about those in a little bit as well. We look at images. I like this image of folks. These people are French Canadians. The top row is meant to represent Indigenous people. The bottom row is meant to represent Canadians. So this is a really good place that we can start when we're looking at images. As we move forward in time, of course, by the 1850s, 60s, even a little bit in the 30s and 40s, we start to see photography. So we've got a lot of, in more modern times, advantages when we've got those photos. Doesn't tell us everything. We'll talk about that as well. And then we also have contemporary objects, which are things from the time period. So, you know, going online, you can do a quick Google search for, you know, I don't know, sweaters from the 1950s, and you'll find a whole bunch of originals, not only available for sale on eBay, which is where I look quite often, but also in museum collections. So those contemporary objects are always a good place to start when you're looking to find information about historic clothing. But all of these things put together are really important to take into account, because all of those things help develop that full picture. We don't want to just look at one resource. We want to look at as many sources as possible. So, and in doing that, what we're essentially doing when we're creating those wardrobes is putting together an exhibit. So I want, if you don't remember anything else from this program, I want folks to remember that putting together historic clothing is very much like putting together an exhibit. You're pulling pieces together from many different sources, and you're building a story, just like if you put a panel at the edge of an exhibit. So kind of going through, breaking those down a little bit, when we are talking about archaeological evidence, we're looking at largely metal goods, so things like buckles, buttons, hooks and eyes, sequins sometimes. I get really excited about sequins because I like sparkle. We're looking at things like lace and beads and pins and needles and thimbles and scissors. Those last 3 to 4 items are more, could be classified more into tools, but in some instances pins are a part of your clothing. So there is archaeological evidence out there of the clothing that people are wearing. I know at my grandparents' farmhouse, there was a ring that my great-grandma dropped on when she was hanging up clothes, and we found that. It's like, oh my gosh, this is, so archaeology doesn't have to be that old. It can be actually rather recent. So when we're talking about the archaeology, those are the things we're thinking of. We also do find that in some places, leather goods as well as other types of textiles do survive in the archaeological record. Has anybody got a bit of a fascination with bog bodies? Okay. I guess I'm alone. But
explain what it is.
A bog body, you guys. So in parts of Europe and the British Isles, there are places where people are preserved in peat. Exactly. And when they're excavated, in some instances, their clothing is very, very well preserved. And apologies, I did have an image of a set of clothing from an excavation that was done in the 1920s. They found a complete bog body with her clothing, and it is cute. She's wearing a short, the lady was wearing, a teenage woman was wearing a short rope skirt or string skirt. She was wearing a crop top. It would look so perfect walking down the street today. So in some instances, those things that we would expect to degrade over time actually do survive. There's also, in Central and South America, there are places where burials have been excavated of folks in the mountains, and they are absolutely perfect. There's been, of course, loads of documentaries done on these things, but archaeology isn't just the metal goods and the bits that people lost. Sometimes it's the people themselves with their clothing in situ. There are also underwater archaeological excavations that, one of the most famous is the Vasa, which was a ship that went down during the Viking Age, roughly, and they found shoes with socks still in them. So archaeologists could study those and understand what is the front side of the knitted stocking, what is the back side. The feet were still in the shoes as well, so we know exactly that fragment was a sock. So there's quite a wide range of things that fall under this archaeological evidence. If anyone wants to talk more about that, I would be delighted to, because it's really fun to study and to look up. But archaeology does encompass quite a lot, and often from one artifact we can really kind of start imagining how that artifact would have fit into one individual's larger clothing wardrobe. So it's a place to start, but again, it's not everything. We also look at written sources, things like shipping inventories. Mackinaw Island, right across the straits, during the 18 teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, up until, really, 30s, 40s, when the American Fur Company pulled out of there. Those shipping records are still, some of them have survived. So we can track how many shirts are shipped to Mackinaw Island. We can track, of course, the ships coming over from Europe. Like, what do those shipments look like? It's pretty incredible sometimes, the vast numbers of things that are being moved around the world, and especially the Great Lakes. We've got personal letters. I know a lot of folks here are interested in Mackinaw history and have studied letters and journals. We were talking about the Women's Club earlier. Sometimes we dig that information out from letters that people save. We've got military records. Some of the returns give us hints about how the military supplied their troops. Store accounts in some instances. Newspaper ads. And I would put catalogs on this list as well. Vintage catalogs. If anyone has ever looked at an old Sears catalog, that tells us a lot. Technology. This is an image of a knitting machine that was invented in the 16th century, and I love it so much because even back then, not everybody liked to knit, and they had machines that could do it. And then, of course, there's other primary accounts that we can pull into our written sources. You never know when you're going to find information about clothing or textiles. Locally, aside from the records to Mackinaw Island, there are some other stored records. There's a fella that worked kind of on the island in the 1820s. He purchased a pair of corduroy pants and a pair of ladies' satin shoes on the same day. I imagine he's shopping not only a little bit of something for himself, a little bit of something for his lady. There's an account of, in the 1770s, an officer at Michilimackinac who gave 120 shirts to the Odawa at La Croche at Cross Village. So, that's really valuable. He also at the same time gave them 30 bedgowns, thread, ribbon, so it shows us how the flow of European goods are moving into these maybe more diverse communities. There's another fellow that kept his papers pretty well, relatively well, and he talks about in the 1770s having a gown made for his daughter, made out of a light blue satin, and the fabric was actually shipped over from England. Then it went to Montreal. From Montreal, it went to Detroit. At Detroit, Madame Perronneau was a dressmaker, and she made this gown up in the French fashion, and then it came up to Mackinaw. It was late. It did not make it here in time. So clues like that can help us as historians look at, like, what are people wearing locally? We want to start small and then grow out, and sometimes we're able to do that, sometimes we're not able to do that. But I like those little tidbits in there. There's also an instant where a man at Mackinaw in the 1770s ordered a dozen pairs of shoes for his wife, and in a letter that he sent, he mistakenly said 2 dozen, and then he sent another letter and was like, no, I don't need 3 dozen pairs of shoes for my wife, I only need a dozen. What? I want those. But it also, in addition to telling us exactly what they're wearing, it tells us a little bit about how they're consuming clothing as well. So that idea that, everyone only had one pair of shoes and one shirt, like, it's kind of blown out of the water by some of these primary documents. It depends on who you are, of course, but we have to be kind of specific and really think about the context of things. We also have lots of images. Does anybody recognize this lady? She lived like 200 yards away from here. Her name is, let's make sure I get all of her names right, Elizabeth Brown Rogers Roche. She was married to an officer and moved to Mackinaw in the late 1760s. This is not her everyday clothes. To be clear, this was done for a painting. This is standard clothing for what this artist put his models in, but it's so exciting. This woman is gorgeous. She's wearing this cream satin gown. It's a particular style called a robe de cour. It's originally a court gown and then kind of sticks around for a long time. It's like fancy dress today. Like my prom dress from when I was 25 years ago, would still be okay to wear today because it's fancy dress. That stuff doesn't go out of fashion very fast. But this lady was painted around the same time as her wedding. So it gives us an idea that she would have been familiar with some of these richer types of things. But she also is a good example of how much people traveled and how fashion really doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's stereotypical, but in a vacuum. It happens within the greater world. So her travels, she's bringing her new ideas. She was in Massachusetts before she moved out here, more or less. Fashion also is impacted by the occupation that people have. I always use the example of my dad who works in the woods. He always had steel-toe boots on. Even if it's summer, he's wearing steel-toe boots because that's what he's used to. That's what he had to wear for work. It's different if you work in an office. It's different if you work here or there. So your occupation has a big impact on how you dress. The local culture, here we know that for a period of time, indigenous clothing had a big impact on how people dressed. We also see clothing coming into the European and American world, especially during the Napoleonic era from Egypt. There's something called Egyptomania, and it just flooded in. So there's local culture, there's trends, but when we are looking at images, we need to be a little skeptical and just know the background of it. We can't just look at an image and say, like, this is how people dressed. We have to dig at it and look at the context, question it. So again, if you were to just look at this image, like, this is, again, not her everyday clothes. But it is an example of something that she may have had worn at one time, clearly. We also can look at images of people and kind of dissect them a little bit. This young man lived in Mackinaw City. This image is from about 1915. He lived at the lighthouse in town at Old Mackinaw Point, and he's dressed really typical for a young man of the time period. Like if you were to see him anywhere else, you'd be like, yeah, that's that time period. So looking at this image tells us that Mackinaw City probably stayed up with the times. Like this is pretty normal for a kid his age. Looking at family groups, especially if we can find images of family groups, that for the historic reenactor or someone that wants to start, doing it as a hobby, family groups are really, really useful. This family lived on Mackinaw Island in this picture is about from 1905 to 1915 is my best guess. But again, another local family, really close to us geographically. Like they're dressed up for a picture clearly, and I included the cow as a throwback to our last program, Roy, because there were so many oxen in the parade. Like it's a trend.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like they're clearly posing for this picture and probably wearing their nicer clothes, but it shows us how the older people dress versus the younger people, like what's appropriate for this region and for this area. This image was done by an artist named William Gardner, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. He took so many photos. His business was taking photos of people on Mackinaw Island. He was a local photographer, so it would have been pretty typical for people to come to his studio. We don't have so many. There's some, but we don't have so many that are staged like this. And I thought this was a really good example. Black and white can kind of be hard. We sometimes just look at everything as being black and white, but when we get into looking at primary source objects, contextual objects, that's when we can start building the color into it. Once we start looking at images, then we can start looking kind of at how we might think about recreating some of these things. My slides are a little out of order, apologies for that. Finding patterns for historic clothing can be difficult. There are sometimes originals. I obsessively collect historic tailoring and seamstress books. A lot of them have now been digitized. Even going back to the 17th century, you can find digitized versions that are now online and available. So there are places to find original patterns, but there are also mass-produced patterns. The big three: Simplicity, McCall's, and I don't remember the other one. There are some bigger mass-produced patterns out there. There are a lot of independent designers as well that have studied garments. There's a company called Canucks Corners. There's another fellow named Henry Cook that produces patterns on a very small scale, and it's always hit or miss as to whether or not you can get your hands on them, but they really are the best patterns for what he's doing. And then there's also an underground network of people. Once you start asking around, you can find some really good patterns. But I would caution folks, if we are using commercially available patterns, when we're using even originals, to always make sure that you can cite the sources. What is the primary source? What is this pattern rooted in? I've used patterns before for making recreated historic clothing, and then found out later on that, well, that's not exactly the way that they would cut things. That's not necessarily the way that they would construct things during the time period. So we do have to, again, look at all of the research and make choices that hopefully hit somewhere in the middle. So, and again, apologies. We're going to bounce back, and those contemporary objects especially can tell us about, in some instances, the identity of the wearer. This pair of moccasins are probably Huron, and it seems like many of the moccasins that are highly decorated with either quill work or beadwork, especially from the 18th and the 19th century, are often meant to be gifts, or they're meant to be worn for special occasions. Everyday moccasins were often quite plain or meant for trade, and you can only learn that by studying documents. So the contemporary objects also help us learn about the values of the people that wore them. You know, what's important from one person to the next. It helps us understand more cultural influences, social statements, again, how people consume clothing. Sometimes original pieces will show how things were altered. I spent part of Sunday fixing some of my pants because I'm kind of short. And if anyone ever sees those, they're gonna know, like, oh yeah, that's been altered. They also tell us about the materials that are being used. You know, is it wool, silk, linen, or cotton? Or is it rayon or nylon? You know, those move forward in time and help us learn about when it was made or how it was used in some instances. And then what is the environment that these things were worn in? So is it wintertime? Is it summertime? Those original objects are really useful to help round out that story. Once we get those four things, the written sources, the objects themselves, archaeology, and images put together, then we can start making it come alive. But we still have some choices to make. So how we decide what to put on a person. If I were going to pull someone from this presentation and say, I am going to dress you like it's 1920, let's start. We have a lot of choices to make. What's your occupation? What's the climate? What are the economic resources? Money always comes into play. What's the social status of this individual? How, again, does personal style play into it? What are your needs? You know, what do you need this clothing to do for you? When I'm designing clothing for folks that work for me, I often think about, you know, what is this person going to need to do in this clothing while they're wearing it? Do they have to get in and out of a car? Do they have to, you know, be doing this or that? So it's important to take that into account, and also the limitations that we have. It's frustrating, but we have to think about how we're going to take care of things, where we're going to store it. Can this person iron a shirt? Like, all of those things need to be taken into account. And sometimes we do make make exceptions, or we maybe change how we ideally would want to do it versus how we have to do it. But at the end of the day, we are looking at the whole picture and trying to come up with the best options. The lady in this image was done again around 1915. She was a writer. Her name's Blanche. She was an inventor. She was an artist. But she's wearing, again, pretty fashionable clothes for the time. She's kind of famous, from Massachusetts, so maybe not completely relevant to Mackinaw, but again, another place that we can look to see what people might have been wearing at a particular time. And then we get to start pulling all the pieces together. So sourcing supplies is really hard. Sometimes we can purchase ready-made garments. Sometimes we can go to the store and find pins that are appropriate, or we can find ribbon that's appropriate. Sometimes there are companies that make historic clothing, and that's all they do. So sometimes we can find ready-made garments. It can be a challenge though. Sometimes wherever you buy it from, it might not be so reliable. You might get shipped things that are supposed to be wool, but they're actually 10% nylon, and that's no good because you don't want anyone to have clothes melt to them. Things might just never show up. Sometimes the fit is bad. Sometimes the construction is bad. So vendors buying ready-made garments come with its own risks. We also are having more and more trouble. I don't know if anyone sews or sort of does this sort of thing already, but it's getting harder and harder to find high quality wool and linen. With the world events right now, most of the really high quality wool that we used to be able to get out of England is no longer accessible because of either tariffs or because of Brexit making the prices just not realistic. The majority of the world's linen comes out of places like Ukraine, and with Russia's attacks on Ukraine, that's disrupting the business, and the prices are going up. I used to be able to buy linen for $8 or $9. Now it's closer to $20 a yard. And if I need 20 yards of linen a year, y'all are wearing your shirts as long as possible. So world events do have an impact on what types of materials we have access to in the modern world, just like they would have in the past. Big world events back then, things were like World War I, World War II, the American Revolution, War of 1812, all those things have an impact on how these fabrics flow into the United States. We also, it can also sometimes be a challenge pinning down notions. So pins, pretty easy. Ribbon is actually remarkably hard to find good historic ribbon. Rayon ribbon is sometimes the best option over silk, depending on the time period. Lace, whether it's wool lace or linen or sometimes cotton, depending on the time period, that also can be really hard to pin down. Especially when you start to get into the nuances of all of the millions of different types of lace in the world, like specific ones for specific time periods for specific places could be 5 presentations in and of itself. And then sourcing accessories, especially leather goods and hats, can also be a challenge. And with all of these things, we really want our clothing that we use for those reenactment events or for anything else to be as natural as possible. And sourcing high quality products really helps create that vision. So sometimes it's easier to do things yourself, but I would love it if I could just go to this catalog and buy one of these beautiful Mackinaw coats. This ad is from about I think it's from about 1920. Was put out by a company out of Chicago that catered to small businesses. You could buy things in lots and then resell them. It's like a wholesale company that later developed into Ben Franklin. If anybody remembers I loved Ben Franklin when I was growing up. So this ad is from a company that kind of helped develop Ben Franklin. But in any case, once we pull all those pieces together, we can take those images, we can take the materials that we've sourced and start making it again come alive. So this is an example of one place that you can do that I've been able to do that. These 2 images on the left side of the screen are pretty typical of folks from the 1770s wearing this style of gown. And then when we recreate it, you can start to see the similarities. So when we're doing all of these, we want to have a clear idea of what we're going for. So very clearly, and this is also another callback to that written source that we had of the lady having a blue satin gown shipped up to Mackinaw. So I got pretty geeked out when I was able to do this project. So not exactly a 1-for-1, but we do the best that we can. There are also other images that we can look at that incorporate props and tools and some of those accessories that we were talking about. You know, again, we've got the primary source image and then the recreated image. So I don't want this to be too serious. Like, it can be pretty fun, but this is a good example of how you can take that primary source and then make it real. So that's one of the most exciting things about rebuilding historic clothing, I think. But it should really always be evolving. It should always be changing. We don't want things to stay static. So historic clothing evolves. What I was wearing as like a middle schooler going to rendezvous is very different than what I'm wearing now in the same context. I've learned a lot. I've also got more resources now. I've got a grown-up job and I can afford, to buy appropriate shoes and to invest in the textiles. But I've also taken a lot of the things that many people, not just me, have been able to research, and it again makes things more lived in and realistic. So we always want to be evolving, we always want to be questioning. I question myself all the time. Should I really be wearing these stockings? Is this color appropriate? You know, we want to incorporate the new information that we're learning, because it is very hard, and it should be hard. It should be hard to recreate an outfit from the 1920s. It should be. And that's not even that, I mean, it's 100 years, but that's not that long ago. So what we're doing with our research when we're creating new things should never stop. We should always keep working on it. And this is another example of how we're continuing to work on things. You know, the primary source here is an image done by a British artist in about 1810, so a little bit later than the time period that I was actually aiming for. But what's interesting when we're looking at socioeconomic status is that sometimes poor people don't buy the new things right away. So there's pretty strong evidence that even in the 1820s in a city like London, folks are still wearing breeches, which kind of went out of fashion like 40 years earlier. So depending on your socioeconomic status, but in any case, we've got our primary image and the recreated image, and there are still some things that I would change. I would maybe have her tie her cap under her chin, maybe not wear glasses, she's blind as a bat, but maybe not wear glasses, and a few other tweaks, but primary source built into the real thing. So it's really fun to do. But again, it is hard, and it should be hard. Some things that we want to use to make historic clothing are just not available. I mentioned linen earlier. The machines that manufactured linen in the past are very different than the machines that are used to manufacture linen today. It used to be more of a common product, and linen plants were developed to have a really long staple, which is just like the fiber length. But when cotton became more popular, cotton has a short staple, a lot of those linen machines kind of went out of use. And so a lot of the linen that we use today is actually processed on those cotton machines, and they cut the fibers. So the linen is never going to hold up as well as it did in the past. It's like with wool, you've got short staple sheep, long staple sheep. The long staple holds up better because there's less opportunity for it to pill or to get weird. So some things are just no longer available. Other challenges that come with historic clothing are just the comfort level of the wearer. To me, if it's done right, everything should be comfortable. People lived in this stuff in the past. We should be able to live in it today. We just have to build it correctly or make it work for the wearer. So one of the best examples, I think, is the horrific corsets. Oh my god. They're not that bad if they're made for you, and I've slept in them before. I've climbed over chain link fences in them before. I've run up Fort Hill in them and run upstairs in them. So there's some modern ideas, I think, that are sometimes put on historic clothing, and we just need to make sure that we're not pulling that in, and that absolutely goes for many things, but especially for comfort. It's like, yes, it's supposed to be snug fitting. Like if we think of that image of the little boy at the lighthouse, his sleeves on his sweater were, by modern standards, quite short. Like a modern person would say, my sleeves aren't long enough, but for the time period, that's how it should be. So we've got to take a step back and avoid those modern ideas. Other challenges come with things like storage and care. It's not easy to take care of lace. It's not easy to take care of a hat. And it's not always necessarily taken seriously. And I say that because I have been in very public places wearing historic clothing, and people sometimes will kind of view it as something other, or, you know, oh, you're in a costume, you're in a play, kind of. I've had a lot of different reactions because I'm kind of a smallish lady. Sometimes I get reactions from folks that aren't necessarily ideal, and I feel like that falls under that category. It's like, no, I'm a person. Like, you still have to be nice to me even if I'm wearing a funny hat. So, you know, that can be a challenge. But going back kind of to talk about those ideas of modern values on historic clothing, I included this cartoon, which is from about 1920. The fella that did this kind of specialized in these like fashion and social commentary cartoons. He was in London, I believe. But it says, if Maud of the 80s, and that's the 1880s, and Gladys of today met one another, what would happen? Well, one of them would say, what strange underclothing you wear, and forgive me, how little of it. Which, yep. The other lady would say, underclothing, you idiot, this is my dress. So even back then, people were picking on one another for how they dressed. They talk with one another for a bit, and as one lady, the first lady leaves, she says, goodbye, I can only say I'm thankful I don't live in your time. Your time sucks. And the other lady says, cheerio, you priceless old peach. Thank heaven I didn't live in your day. So that idea that we all think we're the best, we're the most right, like, it has been around for a while. But I appreciated this little comic. In the world of historic clothing and reenacting and dressing like people from the past, we do have actually quite a lot of really exciting things to look forward to. We were talking about bog bodies and mummies earlier. The technology that's advancing has been able to teach us so much more about those, about everything, but the items that have been excavated than we ever thought that they could. Like, think about modern genetics, you know, isotope analysis, the way that we can shoot light at objects to tell different things about them. It's really quite significantly changing how we look at historic items. Even metal goods can be analyzed today to find out specifically where they are coming from, depending on the makeup of the chemicals in them. You can tell if a nail is from France or England if the right person puts it under a microscope. Technology for me is also allowing us to look at better images. I can look at, you know, very, very detailed images on some museum websites. Some collections that are now available online have made it so much more easy to see things, even down to the threads. So that technology is one of the most exciting things that we have to look forward to. We've got the opportunity to create better and more living exhibits that can be changed regularly. Clothing should be lived in. It's something that has to be cared for, so it naturally changes regularly, and I think that's pretty exciting. We've also got the opportunity with all of those things, especially because most of us are local, to provide more accurate depictions of our specific history. What specific things make historic clothing Mackinaw? And we talked about a few of those, but there are a lot of opportunities there, I think, to build on that. We I was talking to some folks before the program started and mentioned that I sat in on a conference very early Saturday morning because it was hosted by folks in the UK, and they were talking about something that I hadn't heard of, and it's this sweater. It was made in 1806. It was put on a ship from the Faroe Islands intended to go to Copenhagen. It got captured along the way, and it was in a package all bundled up, wrapped up, and it was never opened. It ended up in a collection, passed down, And then I believe in 2024, the museum that takes care of it now decided that they would open it because the package had not been opened since 1806. They could see a little bit of red poking out, but they were able to open it, and it is a pristine sweater from over 200 years ago. It's spectacular. I had never seen anything like this before. As far as I was concerned, sweaters didn't exist until like the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s. So this is a really, really special piece. And in studying it with some of that technology, they were able to tell that the dye used for the red comes from madder. The blue, of course, was indigo. They're working currently on figuring out what type of wool it is, like clearly probably Faroese wool, but it's really exciting to see that advancement, and people have already started making recreations of this sweater. So there's a lot more to be learned from it, and that technology is really driving it.
It looks like it's plastic.
I know. It's gorgeous. It's perfect. It's really beautiful.
I would have never thought of it being a sweater.
It's knit. Yep. It's a knit sweater. Yep. It was probably, it's a style that they call a night sweater, which is a bit deceptive because it wasn't usually worn at night. It's tied to traditional Danish costume, Danish dress, like regional clothing. But this is the only one that they've that exists from the time period that isn't open in the front. Typically they were open in the front and with lace closed. So this is a really unique piece. But yeah, this wasn't open until 2024. So you never know what new and exciting things we're going to learn.
So you started to touch on it with the sweater, but how do you handle like historic colors and dyeing methods? Like how far can you reasonably go, and like what is just like impractical?
Yeah, dyes, it depends. So for a long time it's natural dyes, right? Most of them are still accessible. There's some colors that in the past were very much reserved for very wealthy people, and like that's not really relevant to us anyway. But the textiles that we are able to access in 2026 from historic fabric purveyors are usually already vetted. There's a couple of really good places that will cite the colors that they have chosen for the fabrics that they are going to sell. And most of those places still do use natural dyes, whether it's madder, cochineal, indigo. Those sorts of places are usually the most reliable. Doing it yourself is also fine, but none of us are professional dyers. So the chance that the color is going to go awry is pretty high, and sometimes that's okay. Like sometimes it might not matter, but even in the past, it was often professional dyers that would produce these colors. It's not necessarily the person at home, and that changes over time and in specific places. But yeah, colors are tricky. There are swatch books that exist from the time period. There's a really, really, really amazing collection that has cataloged bits of clothing from often poor mothers from at a place called the Foundling Museum or the Foundling Hospital. And what would happen was a mother would need to give up her baby. When she left the baby, she would cut a bit of her clothes or leave a token or leave a ribbon. And those tokens were put into a book with the baby's information so that if mom ever wanted to come back to claim the baby, she could say, my baby had the heart with this number on it in the book. So they could page through the books, find that, and be like, yes, this is your kid. Spoiler, only about 1 to 3% of the kids were ever claimed by their moms or reclaimed. Moms just unemployment, all sorts of problems. But that collection is really valuable because They're in books. They weren't susceptible to light damage. The colors are stunning in those books, like the bright colors. I really like talking about colors, so thank you for asking. But yeah, hopefully that helps a little bit. We try to look at original swatches that have not been light damaged to get ideas of what the colors should be. Aniline dyes or modern chemical dyes come around in the 19th century, so you have to kind of pay attention to that. There are vibrant greens, beautiful pinks that existed before then, but we have to be a bit careful about the exact shades that we pick. So, but yeah, I would love to get my hands on some of those original swatch books and look at them in person. So, but all of this matters because what we're doing with historic clothing, whether it's for fun, even for a costume party, all of this matters, and this is my opportunity to kind of point out some ways that it matters. It's very eye-catching. Clothing from the past, just like today, is meant to catch your eye. You're meant to go, oh, interesting. I was drawn to sparkles today. Like, that looks beautiful. It draws people's attention in many different ways. When we're wearing historic clothing, it also protects you. If you are doing the same activities that people in the past were doing, then it provides safety, whether you're in the sun, whether you're working by a fire. If you think about, a person wearing flippy floppy sleeves and working, with, chopping wood, that's not safe. So the historic clothing in a lot of instances is meant to help keep the wearer safe. It changes how people move. You're going to move very differently if you're wearing heavy boots or if you're wearing slippers, or, there's a lot of ways that clothing impact how you move, how you hold yourself. And it especially helps further the stories that we're trying to tell. So if I walk into a room and, I'm wearing a Santa costume, like, I clearly want people to think I'm Santa. That's the story I want to share. And it's tied very closely to what we're seeing today. So it's not always a thing in the past. I think most folks recognize these two hats on the screen. I included them because they're very iconic and they're very of the times. We can see these and instantly we've got this whole flood of social issues, cultural issues. We can think of people perhaps that these would be connected to. And in historic clothing, every garment that we put on our bodies does the same thing. If we think of the French Revolution, those Phrygian caps, those kind of floppy caps, those were very similar, actually looked almost like one of these red hats here. If we think of the suffragettes, those sashes that they wore, iconic. Even during the American Revolution, there were people that would wear their politics literally on their sleeves. They would wear buttons with political commentary on them. So clothing is always telling some sort of story. So I very much appreciate it for that. But I think that's about all I have. This is another fellow that tells a story with his clothes. He needs a groom here. But if anyone does have any questions, I think we've got a few minutes. I don't have any questions on the internet, on the chat, but again, if you do have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Or if anything comes up that anyone wants to talk about more, I'll be happy to share any information that I can with folks. Yes, we have a question in the room.
So at the fort, you are constantly changing uniforms and things then?
We are. So as things wear out is the first reason we change things. Mm-hmm. It's usually a 1-for-1 replacement. Right now, special events, sometimes we change things. So a number of years ago we did an 1812 event, so we needed different military uniforms for that. We're trying out this thing. I wanted to try moving in time with the American Revolution. So this year we're celebrating the events of 1776, and there were certain points during that revolution period where shipments of clothing were captured. Those darn Americans. And the clothing that they wanted couldn't get to Canada, or their regular shipments. So there are instances where the men end up cutting up old tents and doing other things and making different styles of clothing. So we do change things in that way. And then as we do archaeology, my greatest interest right now is to figure out a way to figure out an excuse to incorporate sequins into a man's suit. We have a very small piece of metallic bobbin lace, which is a really, really special thing. Metallic bobbin lace was made during the 18th century largely for ecclesiastical wear, so like the stole of a priest, or something related to the church, or it's used by really well-off people as trim. Men trim other waistcoats. Sometimes children's caps were trimmed with metallic lace. Sometimes shoes. There's one pair of shoes in an exhibit that has metallic lace on it. We have a bit of that was excavated. It just blows my mind. So that is a project that I would love to take on. Someone needs to learn how to make metallic bobbin lace, or hire someone to come and do that. And then, that is, again, just a very small fragment. We don't know exactly what it's used for. So in the future, we might incorporate some of those archaeological finds into what we use. And that goes for, the lighthouse or any of the other historic sites. I've got friends that work at, places like Ticonderoga, or, other places out west. And it's kind of the same thing. It sometimes cycles. It's like we get really excited about this for a while, we do it really well, and then the excitement wears off, and then eventually maybe we'll come back to it. So sometimes things do cycle through, but yeah, since I've started working with clothing, I also have just learned a lot. I never knew how even a petticoat was supposed to be made until I looked at some originals. So, sometimes it's just the research that changes it, but yeah, you try to keep as up to date on those sorts of things. Or if we have different people, going back to the idea that clothing is tied to your occupation, your social status, if I have someone that is not going to be getting, grubby and dirty doing this, I will put them in nicer clothes. Or if I can hire a blacksmith, the blacksmith is going to wear it. So yeah, there's some wiggle room there, but yeah. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think we can call it for the evening. The next meeting for our lecture series will be next month. And do we know who it will be?
It'll be Frank.
It will be Frank. So tune in, same time, same place, next month. It'll be Frank. So thank you everyone so much. And again, do reach out if you have questions. I'll be happy to try to answer them. But thank you everybody. Bye. So kind. Yeah, hopefully that was okay.
We'll probably have the same cookies next meeting.